The complete history of Jerusalem, the sacred city at the center of the world. There is a kind of silence that only exists in very old places. Not the peaceful kind, not the gentle quiet of a calm night, but a silence that feels layered, as if beneath every footstep something older is listening, waiting, remembering. Jerusalem is full of that silence. If you were to stand there at night, really stand still, long after the crowds fade and the call to prayer drifts away into the hills, you might notice something strange. The wind doesn't just pass through the city. It seems to carry echoes, footsteps that are no longer there, voices that once shouted prayers, commands, warnings, stone remembering stone. Because Jerusalem is not just a city. It is an argument. It is a memory. It is, depending on who you ask, the center of the world, or the center of everything that has ever gone wrong. And like all complicated things, it didn't start that way. It started small, quiet, almost forgettable. Because, of course it did. Long before kings and prophets, before crusaders and empires, before the word Jerusalem meant anything at all, this place was just a hill, a modest rise in the rugged landscape of the ancient Near East, surrounded by dry valleys and stubborn earth that didn't exactly beg to be farmed. Not the kind of place you'd expect to become the most fought-over patch of land in human history. But geography has a way of making decisions for people long before they realize it. Jerusalem sat at a crossroads, not an obvious one, not like the grand trade routes of Mesopotamia or Egypt, but a subtle one, a place where cultures brushed past each other, where ideas could slip through the cracks, and slowly, almost reluctantly, people began to settle there. The earliest traces go back thousands of years to the Bronze Age, a fortified town known as Jerusalem. Even then, the name hinted at something spiritual, something elevated, something important. Or maybe that's just hindsight talking. Because at the time, it was just another small city trying to survive in a world that didn't make survival easy. Water was scarce, enemies were not. And yet, it endured, which, as you'll see, becomes a bit of a pattern. By around 1800 BCE, Jerusalem was already enclosed with walls, thick, defensive, very necessary walls, the kind that say, we are staying here whether the world likes it or not. And the world, predictably, did not always like it. Canaanite rulers controlled the city at the time, and like many cities in the region, Jerusalem existed in a delicate balance, not powerful enough to dominate, but not weak enough to ignore. It was a place you noticed but didn't fully understand. Then came the Egyptians, because of course they did. Through a mixture of diplomacy, intimidation, and the occasional reminder that they had an army and you probably didn't want to test it, Egypt extended its influence over much of the region, including Jerusalem. And for a while, the city became part of something larger, a distant outpost in a vast imperial system. There are letters, actual letters from this time, clay tablets sent from local rulers to the pharaoh, complaining about enemies, asking for help, generally doing what politicians have always done, which is politely panic in writing. One ruler of Jerusalem, Abdi-Heba, practically begged Egypt for military support, warning that rival groups were threatening the city. It's strangely familiar. Different names, same story. Jerusalem, even then, was not at peace. But the real turning point, the moment when Jerusalem begins its slow transformation from just another city into something far more symbolic, comes with a figure who was part history, part legend, a man named David. Yes, that David, the shepherd, the king, the one with the giant problem, literally. Around 1000 BCE, David captures Jerusalem and makes it his capital. And just like that, the city shifts from regional obscurity to something far more significant. Because David doesn't just rule from Jerusalem, he chooses it. And choices like that, they echo. Under David and later his son Solomon, Jerusalem becomes the political and spiritual heart of an emerging kingdom. And Solomon, not one to do things halfway, builds something that will define the city for thousands of years: the first temple, a place not just of worship, but of identity, a physical space where the divine and the human were believed to meet, a structure that said in no uncertain terms, "This city matters." And suddenly, Jerusalem is no longer just a city. It is a symbol, which, as history will repeatedly demonstrate, is both powerful and deeply dangerous. Because symbols attract attention, and attention attracts conflict. After Solomon's death, the kingdom splits. Internal divisions weaken what was once unified, and Jerusalem, now the capital of a smaller, more vulnerable kingdom, finds itself exposed. Which is when the Assyrians arrive. Relentless, efficient, not particularly interested in your cultural significance. They sweep through the region, conquering, destroying, absorbing. Kingdom after kingdom falls. Jerusalem barely survives. And by barely, we mean it becomes a shadow of what it once was, clinging to existence while larger powers decide its fate. But if there's one thing Jerusalem is exceptionally good at, it's surviving, even when it probably shouldn't. Then comes Babylon. And Babylon does not do half measures. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II lays siege to Jerusalem. The walls fall, the city burns, and the temple, the heart of everything, is destroyed. Not damaged, not looted, destroyed. And with it, something deeper shatters. Because this isn't just a military defeat, it's a spiritual crisis. A moment where people are forced to ask questions they don't want to ask. If this city was sacred, why did it fall? If this place was chosen, why was it destroyed? There are no easy answers. There never are. The population is exiled, taken far from the land they believed defined them, and Jerusalem, once filled with life and ritual and meaning, becomes quiet, empty, haunted, and yet not finished. Because history, much like Jerusalem, has a habit of continuing. The Persians arrive next, led by Cyrus the Great, and unlike the Babylonians, Cyrus takes a different approach. He allows the exiled people to return. He permits the rebuilding of the temple. It's a rare moment of restoration and a story that doesn't offer many. And so Jerusalem rises again, not as it was, but as something new, something shaped by loss, something aware, now, that even the sacred can fall. And this is where the story begins to deepen. Because Jerusalem is no longer just a place people live in, it's a place people believe in, and belief tends to complicate things. A slow pause, as if the narrator is leaning back, letting the weight of it settle. If you were walking through Jerusalem at this point in history, you might notice something subtle. The stones are newer in some places, rebuilt, replaced, but the foundations are older, layered, like memory, like grief, like resilience, and above all, like a story that is far from over. Because soon new empires will arrive, new faiths will emerge, and Jerusalem will find itself at the center of something even larger than kings and kingdoms, something that will draw the entire world toward it, again and again and again. Empires, faith, and the making of a sacred battleground. If you listen carefully, really carefully, you can almost hear it. Not the loud sounds of armies or markets or marching feet. Those come later. They always do. No, this is quieter. The sound of something shifting beneath the surface, of belief beginning to take shape, of a city still rebuilding itself from ruin, slowly realizing that it is about to matter far more than it ever has before. And, as history gently likes to remind us, That kind of importance rarely comes without a cost. By the time the Persians fade into the background, Jerusalem has already lived several lives. It has been a fortified outpost, a royal capital, a shattered ruin, and now something like a cautious resurrection. The temple has been rebuilt, what we now call the Second Temple, not quite as grand as Solomon's, at least not at first, but standing nonetheless. And in a world where survival is never guaranteed, standing is already an achievement. But empires, like tides, do not stay still. They move, they rise, and eventually they arrive. Enter the Greeks, or more specifically, the empire of a man who never actually set foot in Jerusalem, but changed its fate anyway, Alexander the Great. Because of course, one person can't simply conquer half the known world without leaving behind a complicated mess for everyone else to deal with later. When Alexander sweeps through the Near East in the 4th century BCE, Jerusalem quietly becomes part of a much larger story, a Greek world, a Hellenistic world, a world filled with new ideas, new languages, new ways of thinking. And at first, it's manageable. The city adapts. It always does. But adaptation has limits, because culture isn't just what you wear or what language you speak. It's what you believe. And when those beliefs are challenged, things tend to unravel. After Alexander's death, because empires built that quickly don't exactly come with long-term stability plans, his generals carve the empire into pieces. Jerusalem ends up caught between two of them, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. Back and forth, like a city caught in a political tug-of-war it never asked to join. And then, eventually, the Seleucids take control, which is when things start to go badly. The Seleucid ruler, Antiochus IV, now there is a name that tends to show up in stories that don't end well, decides that cultural unity is the way forward, a single identity, a single system, a single way of doing things. You can probably guess how that goes. He attempts to impose Greek religious practices on the Jewish population of Jerusalem. The temple is desecrated, traditional practices are banned. And suddenly, this isn't just politics anymore. It's personal, it's spiritual, it's explosive. What follows is the Maccabean Revolt, a rebellion sparked not by ambition, but by resistance, by the refusal to let identity be erased. It starts small, these things always do, but it grows, slowly, relentlessly, fueled by something stronger than strategy, conviction. And against all reasonable expectations, it works. The rebels reclaim Jerusalem, they purify the temple, they restore their practices, and for a brief, almost fragile moment, the city is independent again. It breathes, it stabilizes, it exists on its own terms, which, as you might expect, doesn't last forever. Because now, Rome is watching. And Rome, as history has repeatedly demonstrated, tends to get involved. By the 1st century BCE, Jerusalem becomes part of the expanding Roman world, not entirely destroyed, not entirely free, but something in between, governed, influenced, managed. And under Roman rule, the city enters one of the most complex periods in its history, because this is where politics, religion, and identity begin to intertwine in ways that are difficult to untangle. And right in the middle of it all, a quiet figure begins to move through the region. Not a king, not a general, not someone anyone in power is particularly worried about, at least not at first. A teacher, a preacher, a man from a nearby town called Nazareth.
You already know his name, Jesus. Now, whatever one believes about him, and history has a way of leaving that question open, there's no denying the impact. Because Jerusalem at this moment is not just a city, it is a stage, and this is one of its most consequential acts. Jesus arrives in Jerusalem during a time of tension. Roman authority is firm, but not loved. Local leadership is cautious, balancing power and survival in a system that doesn't forgive mistakes. And into this fragile equilibrium steps a voice that speaks of something different, something unsettling. Not rebellion in the traditional sense, not armies or weapons or open defiance, something quieter, which oddly enough can be far more dangerous. The events that follow are well known. The gathering crowds, the growing attention, the concern from authorities who, quite understandably, prefer stability over unpredictability. And then, the arrest, the trial, the execution, a crucifixion outside the city walls, a moment that, at the time, might have seemed like just another example of Rome maintaining order, efficient, final, forgettable. Except, it wasn't. Because what happens next transforms Jerusalem in a way no army ever could. The followers of Jesus begin to spread his teachings, at first quietly, then more widely, and over time, what began as a small movement becomes something much larger, a new faith, Christianity. And suddenly, Jerusalem is no longer just sacred to one group, it becomes sacred to another. And the city, already layered with meaning, becomes even more complicated. Meanwhile, back in the realm of politics, which unfortunately does not pause for spiritual development, tensions between the Jewish population and Roman rule continue to grow. Because occupation, no matter how structured, tends to wear thin, and eventually resistance builds. Again, in 66 CE, rebellion breaks out. Not symbolic resistance this time, not small-scale unrest, full rebellion against Rome, which, if you know anything about Rome, is not a decision that tends to end peacefully. The Roman response is swift, decisive, and devastating. Led by the future Emperor Titus, Roman forces lay siege to Jerusalem. The city, once again, finds itself surrounded, cut off, pressured. And this time, there is no escape. In 70 CE, the walls are breached, the city falls, and the Second Temple, the heart of Jewish religious life, is destroyed. Again. There's something almost painfully familiar about this moment. The fire, the loss, the sense that something sacred has been taken, not just physically, but spiritually. And for the second time in its history, Jerusalem becomes a place of absence, a place where something once stood and no longer does. But the story doesn't end there. It never does. In the years that follow, Rome tightens its grip. Another rebellion, the Bar Kokhba revolt, erupts decades later and is crushed with equal force. Jerusalem is transformed, renamed, rebuilt as a Roman city with Roman temples, Roman streets, Roman identity, an attempt perhaps to overwrite what came before, to reset the narrative, to say quietly but firmly, this is something else now. And yet, even then, beneath the new structures, beneath the Roman stone and the carefully planned streets, the older layers remain, unseen, unforgotten, waiting. Because Jerusalem has a way of holding on to its past, even when others try to erase it, even when empires rise and fall above it, even when faiths collide and histories overlap, it remembers. And soon, very soon, another transformation is coming, one that will reshape the city once again, not through conquest alone, but through belief, through revelation, through the quiet emergence of a new voice in the desert, a voice that will carry across centuries, a voice that will bring a new faith to Jerusalem and add yet another layer to a city already heavy with meaning. The rise of Islam and the city of three faiths. There is a moment, just before dawn, when Jerusalem feels almost weightless. The air cools, the stones, still holding on to the heat of yesterday, begin to soften. The sky shifts from black to that quiet shade of blue that never quite knows what it wants to be. And for a brief, fragile instant, the city feels at peace.
Of course, it never lasts. It rarely does here. Because just as the light begins to rise over the hills, so too does another chapter in Jerusalem's long, restless story. And this time, it begins far from the city itself, out in the desert. In the 7th century, something new is taking shape in the Arabian Peninsula. Not an empire, not yet. Not a political force in the traditional sense. A message, a belief, a voice carried by a man named Muhammad. And as that message spreads, quietly at first, then with growing certainty, it begins to reshape the region around it. Tribes unite, identities shift. What once seemed fragmented begins to move with a kind of direction. And eventually, inevitably, it reaches the edges of the world Jerusalem belongs to. At this point, Jerusalem is under the control of the Byzantine Empire, a Christian city governed by a Christian empire layered with centuries of Roman and Greek influence. Churches rise where temples once stood. Pilgrims travel from distant lands to walk streets that are now deeply tied to the story of Jesus. It is, in many ways, a settled identity, or at least it appears to be, because just beyond its borders, change is approaching. In 638 CE, the armies of the early Islamic Caliphate arrive at Jerusalem, but what follows is different. There is no great destruction, no burning of the city, no dramatic collapse of its walls. Instead, there is a negotiation, a quiet, almost understated transition of power. The city surrenders peacefully to the forces of the Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab. And when Umar himself enters Jerusalem, the story says he does so humbly. No grand procession, no overwhelming display of dominance. Just a leader walking into a city that already knows how to carry history. It's a moment that feels restrained, which in a place like Jerusalem is almost unusual. Under Islamic rule, something remarkable begins to take shape. Not perfection, not harmony exactly, but something close to coexistence. Jerusalem becomes sacred to Islam as well, because of a journey, a story, a night that, depending on how you see it, changed everything. In Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have made a miraculous journey, the Isra and Miraj, from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then upward, beyond the physical world. And Jerusalem in that story becomes more than just a city. It becomes a point of connection between earth and heaven, between histories that were once separate and are now, somehow, intertwined. And so the city evolves again. A new structure rises on the Temple Mount, what Muslims call the Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock, a building that doesn't just exist, it announces itself. Golden, geometric, almost impossibly striking against the skyline. Not a mosque in the traditional sense, but something more symbolic, a marker, a statement that this place matters. Nearby, another structure takes shape, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a place of prayer, of gathering, of continuity. And with that, Jerusalem becomes something it has never quite been before, a city sacred to three major faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all layered into the same space, the same stones, the same streets, which sounds, in theory, like a beautiful kind of unity. And in practice, well, you can probably already see where this is going, because coexistence, while possible, is rarely simple, and Jerusalem is not a simple place. For a time, under early Islamic rule, the city remains relatively stable. Different communities live side by side. There are tensions, of course, there always are, but there is also a kind of structure, a system that allows for multiple identities to exist within the same space. It's not perfect, but it works, at least for a while. As centuries pass, control of Jerusalem shifts within the Islamic world itself. The Umayyads give way to the Abbasids, power centers move, political priorities change, and Jerusalem once again becomes slightly peripheral. Still sacred, still important, but no longer at the center of imperial attention. It becomes quieter, not forgotten, just less urgent, which, as history tends to demonstrate, is often when something unexpected happens. Because far to the west, another world is watching, a world that has its own connection to Jerusalem, its own claims, its own sense of sacred urgency: Christian Europe. By the late 11th century, something begins to stir. Pilgrimages to Jerusalem have long been a part of Christian tradition, but now those journeys become more difficult, more uncertain. Stories spread of restricted access, of dangers along the Tariq, some true, some exaggerated, some conveniently framed. And in 1095, a call is made, a speech delivered by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont, a call that is simple in its framing and enormous in its consequences. Take back Jerusalem. And just like that, the city becomes the destination of something far more intense than pilgrimage: a crusade. Now, if you imagined a neatly organized, carefully planned campaign, you might want to adjust that image slightly, because what actually follows is a chaotic wave of movement. Thousands of people, knights, peasants, opportunists, believers, heading east with a mixture of devotion, desperation, and in some cases, a very loose understanding of what they're about to face. It's messy. It's driven by faith, but also by fear, ambition, and the kind of momentum that builds when large groups of people decide they are part of something bigger than themselves, which, historically speaking, tends to get complicated very quickly. By 1099, the Crusaders reach Jerusalem, and this time, the city does not change hands quietly. The siege is intense, prolonged, relentless. And when the walls are finally breached, what follows is not negotiation, it is not restraint, it is quite simply devastation. The Crusaders take the city, and in doing so, they reshape it again. Jerusalem becomes a Christian kingdom. Churches are restored, repurposed, elevated. Islamic structures are transformed. Jewish and Muslim populations are displaced, or worse. It is a moment of complete reversal, a reminder that in Jerusalem, control is never permanent, only temporary. And yet, even in this transformation, the deeper pattern remains, because the city is still layered, still contested, still unresolved. A long, quiet pause, like the narrator is looking out over the city as it changes once again. If you stood in Jerusalem now, at the end of this chapter, you would see a city that has been claimed, reclaimed, reshaped again and again. You would see crosses where crescents once stood. You would hear languages overlapping in the streets. You would feel the tension beneath the surface, the sense that this is not the end of anything, just another turn. Because Jerusalem doesn't settle. It shifts. It adapts. It remembers. And soon, very soon, another force will rise. One that will challenge the Crusaders, one that will bring the city back under Islamic rule, one that will remind the world, again, that Jerusalem is not something you simply take. It is something you contend with. Crusaders, sultans, and the endless struggle for the holy city. There is a particular kind of tension that settles over a city after it has been taken by force. Not the chaos of battle, that comes and goes quickly. Not the noise of victory, that fades even faster. No, this is something quieter, heavier. The kind of tension that lingers in the streets long after the shouting stops. The kind that seeps into the stones themselves, as if the city is holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next. Jerusalem, in the years after the Crusaders take it, feels exactly like that. Victorious, perhaps, but not at peace.
By the early 12th century, Jerusalem has been transformed into the capital of a Crusader kingdom, a Latin Christian city ruled by European nobles who now find themselves governing a place far older and far more complicated than anything they left behind. And to their credit, they try. They build, they fortify, they reshape the city into something that feels familiar to them. Churches rise where mosques once stood. Stone by stone, the skyline shifts again. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre becomes the beating heart of the city, restored and elevated, a place where pilgrims gather in quiet awe. Knights patrol the streets, banners hang from walls, and for a moment, it almost looks stable. Almost. Because outside those walls, the world is watching. And not everyone is willing to accept this version of Jerusalem. In the broader Islamic world, the loss of the city is not forgotten. At first, responses are fragmented, different rulers, different priorities, different struggles. There is no immediate, unified reaction. But over time, something begins to change. A sense of purpose starts to take shape. A quiet realization that this city, this place layered with centuries of meaning, cannot simply remain in foreign hands. And slowly, almost patiently, resistance begins to organize. Enter a figure who history tends to remember with a kind of measured respect, not just for what he did, but how he did it. Saladin. Now, Saladin doesn't arrive like a storm. He doesn't crash into the story with immediate conquest or dramatic declarations. Instead, he builds, carefully, strategically. He unifies fragmented territories, strengthens alliances, creates something resembling cohesion in a region that had long been divided. It's not fast, it's not flashy, but it is effective. And then, when the moment is right, he moves. In 1187, the stage is set. The Crusader states, stretched thin and overconfident in ways that history rarely rewards, find themselves facing a force that is far more organized than they expected. The two sides meet at the Battle of Hattin, and this is the turning point. The Crusader army is defeated, decisively, completely. And with that, the path to Jerusalem opens. Now, if you've been paying attention to the pattern, this long, repeating rhythm of siege and conquest, you might expect what comes next to be familiar. Fire, destruction, retribution. Because, of course, that's what usually happens. But this time, something is different. When Saladin's forces reach Jerusalem, there is a siege, there is pressure, there is the weight of inevitability pressing down on the city. But when it finally falls, the aftermath is not what history has conditioned us to expect. There is no widespread massacre, no indiscriminate destruction. Instead, there is negotiation, ransom, terms, a controlled transition of power. It is not perfect, it is not without suffering, but it is restrained. And in a city that has seen so much blood, that restraint feels almost extraordinary. Jerusalem returns to Muslim rule. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa are restored. Islamic identity returns to the city's visible surface. But Christianity does not disappear. Pilgrims are still allowed. The city, once again, becomes shared in a fragile, carefully balanced way. And for a brief moment, it seems like perhaps, just perhaps, Jerusalem has learned from its past. But history is not known for its restraint. News of Jerusalem's loss spreads back to Europe, and the response is predictable. Another crusade. Because, of course, there is. The Third Crusade begins, led by some of the most well-known figures of the time, including Richard the Lionheart. Now, Richard is many things: a skilled military leader, a charismatic figure, and perhaps most importantly, someone who understands that Jerusalem is not just a city, it's a symbol, and symbols matter.
What follows is a series of battles, maneuvers, and negotiations that stretch across years. Cities change hands, territories shift, victories are claimed, and then complicated. But despite it all, Jerusalem itself remains just out of reach. And eventually, something unusual happens. Richard and Saladin, two figures on opposite sides of a deeply rooted conflict, reach an agreement, a truce. Jerusalem stays under Muslim rule, but Christian pilgrims are granted access. It's not a complete victory for either side, which, in a way, makes it one of the more successful outcomes in this city's history. But peace here is rarely permanent. Over the next century, Jerusalem continues to shift between powers, sometimes through battle, sometimes through diplomacy. At one point, it is even handed over through treaty, no siege, no destruction, just a quiet exchange on paper, as if the city could be something that could simply be passed along. Which, if you think about it, is almost strangely optimistic. But that illusion doesn't last. It never does. By the mid-13th century, a new force emerges from the east, unpredictable, overwhelming, not particularly interested in the delicate balance Jerusalem has been trying to maintain: the Mongols. Now, the Mongols don't hold Jerusalem for long, but their presence in the region destabilizes everything. Old structures collapse, new uncertainties rise, and once again, the city finds itself caught in the middle of forces far larger than itself. Eventually, control settles under the Mamluks, a powerful Islamic regime based in Egypt, and under their rule, Jerusalem enters a different kind of phase. Quieter, less central to global politics, still sacred, still significant, but no longer the immediate focus of constant military campaigns. It's almost a pause, not an ending, just a breath between chapters. If you stood in Jerusalem now, after all of this, after Crusaders and sultans, after sieges and treaties, you might notice something strange. The city looks intact. The walls stand, the buildings rise, life continues. But beneath that surface, everything has changed. Again. Because Jerusalem is not defined by who controls it at any given moment. It is defined by the fact that everyone, at some point, has tried, and no one has ever fully succeeded in holding it forever. And soon, another empire will arrive, one that will hold Jerusalem longer than most, one that will bring a different kind of stability and a different kind of silence. The Ottoman era and the long quiet of empire. There is a different kind of history, the kind that doesn't announce itself. No roaring armies, no collapsing walls, no dramatic speeches echoing through time. Just quiet. Years that pass without catastrophe. Decades that do not demand to be remembered. Centuries that at first glance seem almost uneventful. And yet, sometimes those are the most important ones, because they are the moments when a place like Jerusalem finally exhales. By the early 16th century, after centuries of shifting control, sieges, crusades, and uneasy treaties, Jerusalem finds itself under a new power, a vast one, a patient one, an empire that doesn't rush. The Ottomans. In 1517, the city is absorbed into the expanding realm of Selim I, a ruler known for his decisiveness and his ability to simplify complex geopolitical situations by making them no longer exist. Jerusalem, by comparison, offers little resistance. No dramatic last stand, no desperate siege, just a transition. And with that, the city enters one of the longest uninterrupted periods of rule in its history. Now, if you were expecting constant drama, you might be slightly disappointed, because the Ottoman approach to Jerusalem is not built on spectacle. It's built on administration, stability, and perhaps most surprisingly, restraint. Under Ottoman rule, Jerusalem is not the center of the empire. It is not a capital. It is not a place where emperors reside or grand political decisions are made. Instead, it is something quieter, a provincial city. Important, yes, especially spiritually, but not politically dominant, which, as it turns out, might be exactly what it needs. Because for the first time in a very long while, Jerusalem is not the immediate prize in a global struggle. It is not under constant siege. It is not being reshaped every few decades by new rulers with new ideas. Instead, it is allowed to exist, to function, to breathe. And in that space, life begins to settle into a rhythm. Perhaps the most visible symbol of this era comes under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, a ruler with an appreciation for both power and legacy. And one of his most enduring contributions to Jerusalem is something you can still see today: the walls. Not the ancient ones that were destroyed and rebuilt countless times. New walls, strong, elegant, carefully constructed, encircling the old city like a quiet promise, a statement that says, "This place will endure." Walking along those walls, even now, you can almost feel the intention behind them, not just defense, but preservation. Suleiman also restores key religious sites. The Dome of the Rock is repaired and maintained. Water systems are improved. Public works projects bring a kind of gentle renewal to the city. Nothing overwhelming, nothing that tries to erase what came before. Just careful stewardship. And perhaps that's the most striking thing about this period. The Ottomans do not attempt to redefine Jerusalem. They manage it. They maintain it. They allow its layered identity to remain layered. Muslims, Christians, and Jews continue to live in the city, not always in perfect harmony, because that would be asking a bit too much of history, but within a system that, for the most part, allows for coexistence. Communities are organized, religious spaces are respected, there is structure. And structure in a place like Jerusalem can feel almost revolutionary. Of course, this is still an empire. Taxes are collected, authority is enforced, and life, for many, is not easy. But compared to the chaos that came before, this era feels almost calm. Centuries pass, and that calm continues. Now, calm doesn't mean nothing happens. There are tensions, disputes over holy sites, occasional conflicts between communities, moments where the delicate balance threatens to tip. But these are contained, managed, prevented from becoming something larger. And so Jerusalem remains steady, a city of prayer more than war, a place where pilgrims arrive not with armies, but with quiet footsteps, where faith continues to shape the rhythm of daily life. But outside the walls to the city, the world is changing. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottoman Empire begins to show signs of strain, not sudden collapse, not dramatic failure, just slow weakening, the kind that happens over time, almost imperceptibly at first. European powers begin to take an interest in the region, not just politically, but culturally, religiously, strategically. Consulates are established, foreign influence grows, pilgrimage increases. Jerusalem, once somewhat removed from global politics, starts to feel the pull of outside attention again. And attention, as we've seen, rarely leads to simplicity. New ideas begin to emerge. Nationalism, identity tied not just to faith, but to land, to people, to history. Movements that look at places like Jerusalem not just as sacred, but as belonging. And when multiple groups begin to feel that sense of belonging, things can become complicated. Meanwhile, within the city, change is visible in smaller ways. Neighborhoods expand beyond the old walls, infrastructure improves, population grows. Jerusalem is no longer just the ancient enclosed space it once was. it is beginning to stretch outward, to evolve. And yet, even as it changes, it still carries that same quiet weight, that same layered silence. If you stood in Jerusalem at the end of the Ottoman era, you might feel something unusual. Not tension exactly, not peace entirely, but something in between. A sense that the city is waiting. Because history here doesn't end with calm. Calm is just the space between storms. And beyond the horizon, a new kind of conflict is forming. Not driven solely by empire, not defined only by religion, but shaped by something more modern, more complicated, more personal. Nations, identities, promises, and contradictions. And soon, the Ottoman Empire will fade. The old structure that held Jerusalem steady for centuries will disappear, and in its place, something far less stable will emerge. Empires fall, nations rise, and the modern struggle for Jerusalem. There is something unsettling about watching an old world disappear, not in a dramatic, collapsing sort of way, but slowly, quietly, like a structure that has stood for centuries, simply loosening its grip on time. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire, the same empire that had held Jerusalem in a kind of steady, careful balance for hundreds of years, is beginning to fade. Not all at once, but enough that everyone can feel it. And when something that large begins to fall apart, it rarely does so without leaving complications behind. Then comes a war that reshapes everything, the World War I, a conflict so vast, so consuming, that places like Jerusalem are pulled into its gravity almost without choice. The Ottoman Empire aligns itself with the Central Powers, and when the war turns against them, their territories begin to slip away. And in 1917, something happens that, on the surface, seems almost symbolic. Jerusalem changes hands. Again. This time, it is not taken by siege, not burned or shattered, but entered quietly. The British forces, led by Edmund Allenby, walk into Jerusalem on foot. No grand display, no overwhelming show of conquest, just a deliberate, almost careful entry into a city that has seen far too many dramatic arrivals. It is meant to signal respect, and perhaps a different kind of rule. But intentions, as history often shows, are only part of the story. Under British control, Jerusalem becomes part of what is known as the Mandate for Palestine, a system meant, at least in theory, to guide the region towards stability and self-governance. But theory and reality rarely move in perfect alignment. Because long before the British arrived, something else had already begun to take shape. A movement, an idea, a belief that land and identity are inseparable. Zionism. For many Jewish communities around the world, Jerusalem, and the broader land surrounding it, was not just a historical memory, it was a connection, a longing that stretched across centuries. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that longing began to turn into action. Migration increased, communities formed, a vision of return started to become something tangible. At the same time, the Arab population of the region, who had lived there for generations, held their own sense of identity, belonging, and future. And so, quietly at first, then more visibly, two national movements begin to grow, side by side, in the same space, with different expectations, different hopes, and increasingly incompatible visions. The British, perhaps optimistically, or perhaps just overwhelmed, attempt to manage this. Promises are made, sometimes to one side, sometimes to another, sometimes contradicting each other entirely, because of course they are. Tensions rise, not all at once, but steadily, like pressure building beneath the surface. By the 1920s and 30s, Jerusalem is no longer just a city of layered history. It is a city of growing unrest. Riots break out, communities begin to separate, trust erodes, and the careful balance that once defined the city begins to fracture. Then comes another war, larger, more devastating, one that reshapes not just regions, but the entire global order, the World War II. In its aftermath, the world is different. Empires weaken, new powers rise, and the question of what to do with places like Jerusalem becomes urgent. In 1947, a proposal is made, a plan to divide the land into separate states, one Jewish, one Arab, and Jerusalem something else entirely, an international city, shared, neutral, protected from the very conflicts it had spent centuries embodying. It sounds ideal, in theory, but in reality, it is rejected, and what follows is not negotiation, it is war. In 1948, as the British withdraw, the State of Israel is declared, and almost immediately, conflict erupts. Jerusalem becomes a central battleground. Again, the city is divided. West Jerusalem comes under Israeli control. East Jerusalem, including the Old City, falls under Jordanian authority. Walls go up. Barriers form. Families are separated. Sacred sites become inaccessible depending on which side you stand on. For the first time in centuries, Jerusalem is not just contested, it is physically split. And for nearly 2 decades, that division holds, uneasy, fragile, but real. Then comes another war, larger, more devastating, one that reshapes not just regions, but the entire global order, the Second World War. In its aftermath, the world is different. Empires weaken, new powers rise, and the question of what to do with places like Jerusalem becomes urgent. In 1947, a proposal is made, a plan to divide the land into separate states, one Jewish, one Arab, and Jerusalem something else entirely, an international city, shared, neutral, protected from the very conflicts it had spent centuries embodying. It sounds ideal, in theory, but in reality, it is rejected, and what follows is not negotiation, it is war. In 1948, as the British withdraw, the State of Israel is declared, and almost immediately, conflict erupts. Jerusalem becomes a central battleground. Again, the city is divided. West Jerusalem comes under Israeli control. East Jerusalem, including the Old City, falls under Jordanian authority. Walls go up. Barriers form. Families are separated. Sacred sites become inaccessible depending on which side you stand on. For the first time in centuries, Jerusalem is not just contested, it is physically split. And for nearly 2 decades, that division holds, uneasy, fragile, but real. Then comes another war, larger, more devastating, one that reshapes not just regions, but the entire global order, the Second World War. In its aftermath, the world is different. Empires weaken, new powers rise, and the question of what to do with places like Jerusalem becomes urgent. In 1947, a proposal is made, a plan to divide the land into separate states, one Jewish, one Arab, and Jerusalem something else entirely, an international city, shared, neutral, protected from the very conflicts it had spent centuries embodying. It sounds ideal, in theory, but in reality, it is rejected, and what follows is not negotiation, it is war. In 1948, as the British withdraw, the State of Israel is declared, and almost immediately, conflict erupts. Jerusalem becomes a central battleground. Again, the city is divided. West Jerusalem comes under Israeli control. East Jerusalem, including the Old City, falls under Jordanian authority. Walls go up. Barriers form. Families are separated. Sacred sites become inaccessible depending on which side you stand on.
For the first time in centuries, Jerusalem is not just contested, it is physically split. And for nearly 2 decades, that division holds, uneasy, fragile, but real. Then comes another war, larger, more devastating, one that reshapes not just regions, but the entire global order, the Second World War. In its aftermath, the world is different. Empires weaken, new powers rise, and the question of what to do with places like Jerusalem becomes urgent. In 1947, a proposal is made, a plan to divide the land into separate states, one Jewish, one Arab, and Jerusalem something else entirely, an international city, shared, neutral, protected from the very conflicts it had spent centuries embodying. It sounds ideal, in theory, but in reality, it is rejected, and what follows is not negotiation, it is war. In 1948, as the British withdraw, the State of Israel is declared, and almost immediately, conflict erupts. Jerusalem becomes a central battleground. Again, the city is divided. West Jerusalem comes under Israeli control. East Jerusalem, including the Old City, falls under Jordanian authority. Walls go up. Barriers form. Families are separated. Sacred sites become inaccessible depending on which side you stand on. For the first time in centuries, Jerusalem is not just contested, it is physically split. And for nearly 2 decades, that division holds, uneasy, fragile, but real. Then comes another war, larger, more devastating, one that reshapes not just regions, but the entire global order, the Second World War. In its aftermath, the world is different. Empires weaken, new powers rise.
The city that never ends. Jerusalem does not have a simple ending. It cannot be neatly summarized or quietly concluded, because it is still unfolding. It is a place where the past is never entirely past, where every stone has a memory, where every street has been walked by someone who believed they were part of something eternal. And maybe that's the closest we can come to understanding it, not as a place that belongs to one story, but as a place where many stories continue to exist, side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. A city that has been destroyed and rebuilt, claimed and reclaimed, loved and fought over, again and again and again. And still, it stands. Not as an answer, but as a question, one that the world is still trying to understand.